Hello, everyone. My name is Susan Morales. Our special guest for today is Elizabeth Urbanowicz, and we're going to have a conversation about how we can teach the little ones in our life how to identify worldviews and think through them with a biblical perspective. But first, Elizabeth, can you tell us about your background and about your organization, Foundation Worldview?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on today, Susan. It's fun to be with you. And as you said, I'm Elizabeth Urbanowicz, and I started out my professional career as an elementary teacher in a Christian school. And I just love working with kids, and I loved my job. And several years into my teaching experience, I noticed a little bit of a problem that the students in my classroom, they came from these great Christian homes and, I was giving them a biblically based education all day long, but they were still rapidly absorbing ideas from the culture without ever giving it a second thought. And so that realization is really what led me into the world of apologetics, in that I knew that there was this problem and I didn't know exactly how to address it. So I started seeking out what resources are there, what can I do to actually get these kids that God has placed in my care critically thinking through the Christian worldview. And so that just led me on this journey of studying apologetics and then eventually creating apologetics resources for the children that God had placed in my care. And eventually, God led me out of the classroom to work on this full time. So I got a master's degree in Christian apologetics from Biola, right out near you, Susan. And then now work full time on developing materials that other parents and teachers and church leaders can use with kids to get them really critically thinking through the truth of Christianity.
Your organization creates curriculum, correct? So, for example, a homeschooling mom could go to your website and purchase a curriculum and use that for, would it be like for a year, or can you explain a little bit more about your curriculum?
Yes. So our goal at Foundation Worldview is we know that moms and pastors and teachers are so busy with all of the responsibilities that God has given you. So our goal is to give you all of the tools that you need packaged nice and neatly in one digital package to be able to implement with the kids in your life. So we have curriculum that's available for homeschooling families. And also we have some non-homeschooling families that use it. Their kids might go to a Christian school or to public school, but they still choose to use our materials. We also have materials for Christian schools and then materials for churches. And right now, when we're recording this interview, it's a Saturday afternoon, and we currently have 1 year of material out. However, on Monday, we're going to launch our second year of material. And then this summer, we're going to launch our third year of material so that we have material for all different ages. And so, like I said, our goal is really to take away all the guesswork and the prep work away from busy moms and busy pastors and teachers so that you have all the tools you need to really equip your kids in this way.
Okay, and I remember, if correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember listening to you speak in the last Women in Apologetics conference. I think it was one of the workshops or the
Mhm.
breakout sessions, and
Yeah.
I think you mentioned that you were going to create curriculum even for the younger age children. Is that going to be available soon or in the future?
Yes, in this summer. So hopefully, we're hoping in the month of June. There's a slight possibility it might be in July, but hopefully in June, we're going to release our first mini series for preschoolers because we want to equip, even little guys like 4, 5, 6, 7 to get their bodies and their mind involved in thinking through what is true and how do I know what is true. So yes, good memory.
Okay, yeah, I would definitely have benefited as a homeschooling mom to have a resource like that. I kind of recently became interested in learning about apologetics through Mama Bear Apologetics, their book,
Mhm.
and I saw the
Yep.
relevance in me learning as a mom, kind of seeing it through my child's perspective when they are going to have questions, and I want to be the one to give them some answers. And so it's been an interesting experience beginning to homeschool. It's actually
Mhm.
been 2 years that I've been homeschooling now. And something that I've noticed is I will buy books for my kids and just very randomly and very frequently there will be topics mentioned in a book that perhaps isn't even about that. For example, evolution, just different topics that I would like to discuss today with you. And
Mhm.
so I feel like for homeschooling parents, it's one of those things that you're confronted with a decision. Am I going to avoid? Am I going to skip this page? Am I even going to introduce this idea, this belief out there in the world? And it's going to kind of challenge my kids' understanding of their own religion that we
Mhm.
are learning in our home. So it's kind of like when it's a little difficult for a parent to try to come up with a way of responding to your kids and teaching these things. And especially with children so young, it's a little surprising to me that a lot of resources, movies, TV shows are introducing big ideas to
Mhm.
very young kids. So I'm
Yes.
really glad that you are providing this curriculum and also that we're going to discuss some of those difficult topics
Mm.
today. I would like to ask out of curiosity, how many years were you a teacher? You said, I think you said a third grade teacher?
Yeah, so I started out in fourth grade and then went down to third grade after that. So a total of 10 years I spent in the
Wow,
classroom.
awesome. And since were all of those years in a Christian school?
Yes, all of those years were in a Christian school. So I grew up in going to public school. And then when I did my student teaching, I did that in a public school as well. And I actually had no intention of going into Christian education at all. I had double majored in Spanish and I really wanted to work more in an urban environment with ESL. And then God just planted me in a Christian school. And I'm so thankful that He did.
That's awesome. As a public school student like myself, did you ever struggle with some of the things that you were being taught? Were you a Christian back in those years?
Yes, yes. So I grew up in a Christian home and I, turned from my sin and trusted in Jesus when I was in first grade. And I know a lot of people might be really skeptical, like, oh, did you really? And my parents were great about not pressuring me into anything that, my mom would, tell me the gospel and, ask me, if I was ready to turn from my sins and trust in Jesus. And she told me that for 2 years, I kept saying, nope, I'm not ready to do that. I'm not ready to do that. And then one day in first grade, I said, you know what, I think I'm ready. So I was a Christian during my time in public school. And there definitely were a lot of questions that I had, just coming from such a different worldview than those around me. The things that I was taught in science class were so different than the things that I was learning at home and that I was learning at church. And, then in high school, the decisions my friends were making, and also, even what was being taught in health class and in so many different classes were just so different than everything I had seen modeled for me and taught at home. So yes, it was a very interesting experience.
Did you find yourself having the skills to critically think like through a biblical worldview, or is it until now that you've really figured out how maybe you should have in the past? I know that's my personal experience.
Uh, yeah, that's a really good question. Um, I think I was thinking through these things, and I was like, okay, I know there's these different perspectives, and in sometimes I'm more of a type A, firstborn, kind of toe the line. I wasn't a super rebellious child. So in school, I was more just like, okay, I know the right answer to write on this test. Like I know what I'm being taught at home. I'm going to stick with what I'm being taught at home. I don't know that I ever really critically thought through why what I believed was true, or even if it was true. I know there was definitely things that I wondered. I grew up in the time when the church would use the language, like asking Jesus into your heart. And I remember like thinking when I was like 14, like I've read a lot of the Bible and I haven't seen anything in the Bible about asking Jesus into your heart. Like, what is this about? So definitely it caused me to think more, but I don't think I had the skills really to think critically until I started seeing the need to guide my students in this. That's when I started, really diving down deep and realizing like, oh, like not really even equipped to think well through the Christian worldview. And so that's my journey into apologetics, with a lot of like unlearning and relearning things correctly. So that's a great question.
In your time in your Christian school as a teacher, did you feel that the school was discussing or encouraging teachers to bring up different worldviews and helping them process through those things? Or was it more your own personal mission to educate yourself and do that for your own students?
Yeah, the school that I taught was a really great school, and they did do a decent amount of worldview training, which was great. Um, it was really more on my own that I started thinking through, okay, how can I get these kids thinking? Because one thing that I noticed, I'm really a passionate teacher, and I love talking about God's word, and I love talking about a biblical worldview, and especially in third grade, when kids are 7, 8, 9 years old, when they're at that like 7, 8 range, they'll believe anything you tell
Mhm.
them, and especially, back then, when I was in my early 20s, especially like the girls, like they'll believe anything that you tell them, and I was like, this is great. I can preach the truth to them all the time, and they're just soaking it up. And then I started watching them go up in the grade levels. And, once they were in fourth grade, fifth grade, especially sixth grade, they didn't really care what I thought anymore,
Mhm.
because I was no longer one of the primary influencers in their life. So that's what really got me thinking several years into my teaching, thinking, okay, when these kids are in my class, they'll believe anything that I say, like, and if I tell them Christianity is true, they believe it. But how can I give them the skills so that once they're in sixth grade and they don't care what in the world Miss Urbanowicz thinks, and they care
Mhm.
more what their peers think, they care more what actors and actresses think, how can I equip them with the skills to discern truth when they no longer care what I think? So that's what really kind of made me dive in even deeper than where the school I was teaching at was going, because I realized, okay, if I want to have like a lasting impact, beyond this third grade year, I need to develop thinking skills rather than just simply telling them the truth really passionately.
Right. And in all honesty, I think it can be a little frightening for some parents, maybe for some teachers, to think that as we are, with our good intentions, teaching and preparing these children for the world and everything they're going to hear and learn about, there's like this hesitation that I may cause some doubts in my child. I shouldn't have brought these topics up. What would you say to people that feel hesitant like that?
Yeah. Well, first, I would just affirm that feeling, because, I'm not a mom, but I know from watching friends of mine, I know from interacting with my, nephews and niece who I love dearly. I know from, just being a teacher who cares about students, that it's a very, like, being a mom or a dad is a very weighty responsibility. You're given this child, that God has gifted you with, and you just want them to know and love Jesus, and you're trying to do the best that you can, and you're following scripture, but there's not like a day by day, day 923, make sure you do this with your child, and that can be really intimidating. So I just want to, anybody who might be feeling intimidated, about discipling their kids, just affirm that feeling, that it's normal, and that it means that you're on a good trajectory because you're really caring about your kids' spiritual formation.
I remember you said something in that breakout that really spoke to me concerning this feeling. You said that they're going to have these questions later on in life, and it's actually better for them to engage with those feelings, those doubts, those things while they're still in our home.
Yes, because that is so vital, because a lot of times we might think, like, what, I just want everything they're exposed to be Christian. Like, I just want it all to be true. I don't want them to be exposed to these other competing worldviews, these other ideas, these lies. And that protective instinct is a good one, but if protection doesn't equal isolation, but protection equals preparation, that we're preparing our kids, because as you said, our kids are going to have questions, they're going to have doubts, they're going to encounter different ideas that might sound true. And the best thing for us to do is to slowly expose them to those ideas while they're still within the protection of our home, of our church, of our school, so that they don't go out in the world and are completely unprotected. It's kind of like, so even before COVID, I have been a huge germaphobe. Like ever since again, first grade was a big year for me. My teacher read us a book called Germs Make Me Sick, and I like freaked out. So I've been a huge germaphobe. And my first few years of teaching, I would get sick all the time. Most teachers in their first few years, they get sick all the time, because they're just exposed to these germs for the first time. But then, like my third year, my fourth year, I was still getting really sick. And it wasn't normal. So I went to the doctor and was just talking through, like, why is this like my ninth sinus infection of the year? Like, what's going on? And as we were talking, he was asking me about if I used hand sanitizer. And I said, oh yes, like I use hand sanitizer all the time. And he was like, how many times a day do you think you use it? I was like, I don't know, like 30 probably, like anytime I touch anything a student touches, I use it. And he was like, well, what you're doing is you're killing all of the good bacteria on your hand. He was like, and you're also getting rid of all the bad bacteria, which means you're not getting exposed to it at all. He was like, so then you're so susceptible. He's like, what you should do, use it before, like wash your hands before you eat. If somebody like coughs on your hands, use it, but stop using it all the time. And it was amazing. Once I followed that advice and my body was slowly exposed to more bacteria and viruses, like I would only get sick like once to twice a year, as opposed to, like 9, 10 times. And so it's similar with our kids, like you don't want to, I wouldn't sit down, like and let somebody cough in my face for 10 minutes. Like that's a dumb idea. But by having just slow exposure, by not sanitizing my hands like 5 times an hour, I was then my body was able to handle those different germs that came in. And it's the same with our kids, when these alternate worldviews come in, if we just give them tiny little exposures when they're still within the safety of our own homes, we're building up that immunity, like where if we continually sanitize everything, and keep them completely healthy when they're in our homes, then when they go outside of it, they're really going to be in a place where they're very vulnerable because they've never heard these ideas before. They've never had to think critically through them. So I would just encourage parents that, safe and loving exposures to different ideas can be very helpful.
So definitely do not indoctrinate our
Right.
children, right? How would you define indoctrination?
Yeah. So indoctrination, like in some sense, in the traditional sense of the word, isn't necessarily bad. It's teaching sound doctrine. So teaching our kids, the sound doctrine and theology of the Christian faith is a really good thing. The way that word has kind of been twisted is to teach truth without teaching thinking. So if we're not teaching them the why behind things and we're not teaching them how to think, then what we're doing is we're basically training them to blindly follow whatever voice happens to be the loudest,
Mhm.
because we're using our, like God-given, beautiful authority that God has given us in their lives, and when they trust us. And if we don't give them any reasons why to believe that Christianity is true or to understand why other worldviews are false, we're just training them, trust me, I'm an authority, authority. Well, then once they get to, 11, 12, 13 years of age, just in the natural developmental progression, they start to care a lot more about what their peers and what their role models outside of the home think. So if all we're doing is training them to listen to me, listen to me, listen to me, well, then once that influence shifts, they're just going to listen to their peers, like listen to the media, where if we can train them, to think why and to really critically think, it's just a very powerful tool. I do have to give a heads up. It is a very difficult, because when we train our kids to ask why and to critically think, they're going to ask that of us a lot more often. And in the heat of the moment, it's really annoying because you just want to be like, because I said so. But if we're able to put in that hard work of actually working through the why and training them to think, we're really setting them up for success when they're like when they're in those later developmental stages.
With my kids, my son's about to be 6 and my daughter's 7. And I guess I've been teaching my kids and trying to like help them to think more about what I just said. So I find that sometimes when I want to give them a simple answer, they'll push back and they'll continue to ask, even though they're so young.
Mhm.
And it's really interesting because there are some questions that they ask that they're so deep, but it's like their little brains want to know some answers. But if I were to explain it to you, I don't know if you would understand. Like sometimes when something bad happens, like my youngest will say, "Why did God let that happen?" And so it's kind of like, well, how do I explain that in a way that you're going to understand? Because, you'll bump into like the problem of pain and suffering and all of those things that people explain in great depth. And so it's really interesting as a parent trying to find a way to summarize that to a 5-year
Yeah,
old.
it is. So just some resources you may or may not be aware of. Are you familiar with Natasha Crane and her books?
I haven't read them, but I want
Okay.
to.
Okay, well, just for you and for your audience, Natasha Crane's Talking with Your Kids About God and Talking with Your Kids About Jesus, those are really helpful resources because it explains like the apologetic concept in the chapter, and then it gives you some helpful discussion points to go through with your kids. So those can be a really helpful resource just for like, how do I explain this? Where do I go? And then for actually the problem of pain or the problem of suffering, if you go to my website, foundationworldview.com, we have a whole blog series that's just written for kids that's called Mommy, Why Does God Let Bad Things Happen? And so that's just meant to be read through with kids because to help take some of these really hard concepts, and bring them down to a level that little kids can understand.
Yeah, I was skimming through your blog, and I definitely feel like I'm going to follow your blog because it's so relevant to what I'll be dealing with. I would like to discuss some of the things that have come up in my own homeschooling experience and kind of get your views on how you would tackle that to a kindergartner, first, or second grader. Do you have any guidelines, any advice for the kinds of things that we want to expose our kids to or we want to skip on regarding books? TV shows, movies, documentaries, what would be too much or what would be like too little exposure?
Yeah, that's a question that's complicated, just because every child is different, and even as parents, our consciences are going to be different. And Romans 14 makes that clear. That different Christians are going to have convictions over different things. Now we know there are certain things that are just plain evil. Okay, we're not going to expose our children to sexually explicit content. That's just evil. We're gonna, we're gonna say no to that in our homes. Then when it has, when we're thinking about, what kind of books or what kind of, shows or what kind of music or what kind of movies are we going to expose our kids to? My main advice would be whatever parents decide to make it a very intentional decision, to make it something that you've actually viewed beforehand. And so you're aware of what's coming up, which I know that's easier said than done. But to make it very, very intentional, that means for some families, anything that has, an element of magic in it, a parent might feel very uncomfortable with that, and they might, decide that, what, if this has any part of magic, we're not going to have that in our home. Where other families might say, what we're going to do is we're going to read through this book, and then we're going to talk, about what God says, about supernatural things, that there are supernatural things that he causes. And then there are supernatural things that, other spiritual beings that are God's enemies cause, and so like, let's look at, where does this fall? Um, as far as books that have other or TV shows that have other worldviews, as you mentioned, it's most books that we pick up have very strong worldview perspectives in them, and so I think what it comes to then is how what amount of time do we have and how intentional are we going to be? Like, several weeks ago I was babysitting my nephews, and it was right before snack time, and we were reading a book, and I could tell that like they were paying attention, but I was kind of losing them. And there was a page, it was a science book on ocean life. There was a page that talked about like millions of years and these animals evolving, and I was like, you know what, they're not in, like they're hungry. They're not in like a mental state right now where we can have a really great conversation
Mhm.
about, like who created these animals, or were they, did they just accidentally arise? So I chose in that moment to skip over that, because I just thought, what, now is not the best time for them developmentally, hunger wise, to have this conversation. Where next time I'm over there, I'm probably going to be intentional about picking up that ocean life book again and reading through that page and talking with them about like, okay, like, so what does the Bible say about ocean life? Who did somebody create this, or, was it an accident? Okay, well, what is this book saying? Is this book saying that God created them, or is this book saying that it's an accident? Oh, it's an accident. That's so interesting. So this book then doesn't align with what God's word says, and then come back later and like, give them a little activity that we can do so that they see why the creation perspective actually lines up with what is real. Like a good simple activity that I would do with my nephews is, they have a bunch of big floor puzzles, that you put them together. There's only like probably only like 10 pieces, because they're 2 and 4, so they're young. So to take that floor puzzle and say, okay, let's put all the pieces in the box and shake it up and say, okay, we want to make this puzzle happen by accident. So then let them throw the pieces up in the air and say, oh, did this actually make the picture by accident? No, it didn't. Okay, let's try it again, like, and put it back in, like, let's see if we can get it by accident. And then just have them see that, like, okay, accidentally this puzzle does not come together. And then think, how could this puzzle actually come together? Oh, you and I could make it. Okay, you and I could create it. And then, put the puzzle together and then talk through, so did the puzzle come together on its own accidentally? No, it didn't. We actually needed a smart person, somebody who's a creator, to put it together and then make the connection. When we look at the flea, there are so many different parts to their body, and there's so many different things they need to do. If a puzzle can't come together accidentally, do you think this could? So just choosing wise times. Does that kind of answer your question about what to let in and what not to?
Yeah, definitely. I ran into a page. It was actually a book on nutrition, but they wanted to do a whole history of food. And it was interesting that they started off with man, and they had a picture of, the typical picture where a man looks like this, then he's looking more upright, and so that was one of those things where I wasn't sure if the actual picture itself was going to serve as an authority for my kids. I had to kind of explain to them that there are people behind the book, and those people have their own beliefs, and sometimes those people don't believe in God. And so, especially
Mhm.
when evolution comes up, we I do bring up, like you said, like different examples. Well, did this thing just come out of nothing? And what about our bodies, like you said? So it's one of those things that I personally struggle with, not being sure if it's okay to have certain books that have certain things that are being said as if that is the truth, and they're not necessarily saying, well, this is a theory, and some scientists disagree. I guess something that I've
Right.
decided to do is, well, some of the books that do present it in such a way, then maybe I'm going to keep them in a shelf. I'm going to go over with them, but I'm going to keep those in a book so that I make sure that when the kids are reading that, we're having those discussions. And I guess at a certain age, maybe that won't be necessary anymore. I'm not sure yet.
I love what you're doing there. Just with the intentionality of saying, okay, I know that these books have an alternate worldview, so I'm going to keep these over here to make sure that I'm going through them with my kids. And like you said, being intentional about having those conversations when those things come up. And right now, you said your kids are 6 and 7, right?
Yeah,
Is that correct?
yeah. About to be
Yeah.
sick.
So, okay, once you've had these conversations, and when then they're at like the 7, 8, or 8, 9 range, that's when you can, the time when you can actually have them be almost more out like on a treasure hunt for this. Like, let's see, like, let's just see in our normal life, or when we watch a TV show, or when we read a book, where do we find people or presenting information as if God created the world? Where do we find people presenting information as if everything on earth just happened by accident, that it's one big accident. So then they can be on a treasure hunt. And then once they are, in that 8, 9 range, that's when you can do some more critical thinking activities with them so that they're actually seeing like, oh, I'm not supposed to believe that God created the world just because mom said so. Like I'm supposed to believe that God created the world because when I look at all the evidence, like this is actually what it points to. Like this is true. When I look at this honestly, it points to God. So I know like what you just said, it's a struggle to know, when is it wise and when is it not, but it seems like you're being very intentional, Susan, and you're really on a good trajectory there.
Thank you. I think apologetics, just starting to learn apologetics, has really pushed me to to not take the easier route and just don't talk about anything else, and
Yeah.
don't. But it's interesting how, like, even when you're reading the Bible, you read that these people did these things and they didn't believe in God. So it would be like I wouldn't even be following scripture's guidelines if I didn't want to inform my kids about people in the world believing different things, right?
Yep,
So
absolutely.
I guess we've kind of gone through evolution, the Big Bang. Anything to add to that, like when that comes up?
Just just the same things that I said, just to be intentional. And then when I gave you like the puzzle example before, something always to think about with kids, especially little kids, is when we're talking about like theories and things that are just very abstract. A great way developmentally to get kids to understand that is always to attach it to something concrete. When you think about teaching your kids math, when you were teaching them how to add, when they're 4 or 5 years old, you probably just didn't shout out, 5 plus 3. What you did is you got out blocks or you got out Legos or you got out buttons and you had them count them and put them together. And then you showed them the numbers 5 and 3 and 8. And so it's the same way when we want to get our kids to think critically about anything in life. We want to take an abstract concept and attach it to something concrete. So that's why something like the puzzle example that I gave can be a great thing to do with little kids because it helps them understand those abstract concepts.
I was also realizing that when you buy Christian curriculum for homeschooling, sometimes you'll even come across different views within Christianity, for example, dinosaurs. So
Mhm.
there's that debate itself. And I guess it was one of those conversations where I also had to talk to my daughter. Well, different Christians believe different things. I just found that really interesting.
Yes. And a really healthy thing, because if you just teach your daughter one thing and she thinks that every Christian believes that, and then she grows up and starts watching YouTube videos, or goes off to college or just has friends outside of the home and she realizes, wait, not every Christian believes that,
Yeah.
then it's much more likely that she's going to be like, wait, what else that my mom told me might not be what everybody believes. So it's so helpful to be honest about, different Christians believe different things and, here's some of the reasons why. So that was great that you did that.
We went over witchcraft and magic already. That was one of the things that I first realized that it was so predominant in a lot of movies. I saw you
Mhm.
had a blog on Frozen, I think.
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to reading that. Did you want to share a little bit about that just briefly?
Tell you the experience. It was a very interesting experience for me because, I have a small following on my blog, several hundred people, but because everyone had been waiting for Frozen 2 to come out, for like 5 or 6 years, and I happened to release that article the day the movie released, it got, probably like 50,000 views on the first week. And so there was tons of people commenting, and it was so interesting because what I like to do, again, I understand that everyone's going to have different convictions about things, and that's fine. And I wasn't trying to push people into seeing Frozen 2 if they didn't feel right about it. But it was just so interesting because what I like to do is I like to give parents the tools that if they're going to choose to expose their kids to something, how can they have deep, meaningful conversations? Because there's some things in Frozen 2 that Disney did a really good job at. It like aligns with the biblical view of like humanity and the biblical view of love. And then there are some things that are just completely from like a new age perspective, just about, it's more like panentheism, like God being in everything. So I just want to help parents have these conversations. But it was so interesting because there was just all of these comments on the blog of people like accusing me of pushing them into witchcraft, and Satan was behind this blog. And I was just like, oh, this is so very interesting. But I understand that that people are going to have different convictions about things. And a movie like Frozen 2, that's totally something where some people are going to feel fine taking their kids to it and they can have meaningful conversations. And then other parents who think, what, I just don't feel comfortable taking my kid to see that movie. And, God has given each parent their children, and it's their responsibility to raise them, and so if that's the conviction, then I would say stick with that conviction.
Something I found interesting for the age group that my kids are in is that it seems that even though I have a conversation with them, maybe it doesn't click completely just yet because, for example, we watched a Barbie movie and in it they taught visualization. And as a Christian person, I also asked Jesus to come into my heart at like probably the same age as you. And I haven't really learned like too much about New Age, so I was Googling a few things, and I found it really interesting that they included that, and they were teaching children how to visualize in the movie, indirectly, of course. And what was interesting was I had a conversation with my kids after about it, but then they were still playing, and in the things that they were saying, they were visualized that. So it was one of those things where I'm like, okay, maybe I should avoid certain things if they're not old enough to understand it, or maybe just keep having a conversation about maybe don't play visualization, maybe, and it's one of those things where they're so young and they do understand that it's bad, but it's kind of hard, I guess, for them to like really understand that it's not just play, it's not just imagination. And yeah,
Right.
that's kind of a struggle.
That's a great example where different parents are going to have to be discerning. If your children, even after conversations, just take non-biblical parts of entertainment, and incorporate it into their play, then it might be a really great idea to not, not watch that episode or not watch that show or that movie again, where, another child might, watch it, and not think another thing about it. So that's really where, discernment and following the Holy Spirit comes in.
Yeah, let's talk about violence and death. Those are also big themes in a lot of these movies, popular movies, especially the ones I grew up watching, the classics with the princesses. And definitely was scary for me as a child, not really understanding how to process the reality of death, for example. And there's definitely no mention about God and heaven in a lot of these movies. So it can be really scary. And in a lot of classic stories, I guess fables, there are certain events that are quite violent and graphic. And one of my kids happens to be very sensitive. And I would be like, let's watch this movie, and it'll be too much for that child. And they won't even want to be in the room, or I'll be in the middle of a story and they'll just want me to stop. So what do you think as like a teacher? Should we like stop if our child is maybe overly sensitive, or should we just kind of tread slowly? What do you think?
Yeah, that's again where just, discernment is going to come in, and every child is different. So, what your son can handle, might be different than what your daughter can handle. And so you're just going to want to act accordingly. So I would say, especially at that age, 6, 7, 8, when they're really young and if they're sensitive to things, it's a great idea, not to overexpose them. If they're like, stop, please, I want to stop, that's a really good idea. And then when they get older, 9, 10, 11, working through with them, like what are appropriate responses, if you are uncomfortable with what you are seeing, like it's probably not, appropriate, if you're at somebody's house, just like plug your ears and start screaming, but, what is a good response? How can you tell whether it's wise, to get up and to stop, being exposed to that content? Or when is it wise to say, okay, this makes me feel a little uncomfortable and it's a little scary, but I can trust God in this, because I know that God, is always, he's always with me, and I can trust that he's working all things together for good. But especially at those young ages, if they're uncomfortable, it can be a great thing just to stop. Even my oldest nephew, he's very intense and he has a very, very tender heart. And his parents don't do a lot of screen time with him, but they did show him, I think it was Disney's Robin Hood, and there's a scene where the sheriff of Nottingham takes away this little bunny's coin, that he had been given for his birthday. And my nephew saw it and was just like sobbing, because his little heart was breaking for this
Yeah.
bunny and how the sheriff had been so mean. And so my sister-in-law decided, like, oh, you know what? Like, it's so great that he's sensitive to this, but we're going to stop this because, he doesn't need, to be crying throughout the whole movie because of how the sheriff of Nottingham and Prince John are being so mean to all the other people. So at that tender age, it can be a really good idea not to overexpose them. And then as they get older, to just teach them, what are good skills? How do we discern when it's wise to turn something off and to walk away? And how do we discern when it's wise to know, like, okay, I feel really uncomfortable right now, but I can trust God in this, especially as you think through, learning about history. As you learn about different wars and different things that people went through, like there's going to be a lot of things that are uncomfortable there, and we don't need to overexpose them. But even, when they have those feelings of like, oh, I'm scared, I don't like this, knowing like, okay, we can trust that God is sovereign. And even when bad things happen, he's promised to work them together for good for those who love him.
That's a great point. See the good that God can bring out of evil. How about Greek mythology? I know it's something that, for example, in one of the books that I have for second grade, they're already including Greek mythology, and this is something that I personally struggled even in junior high. I didn't understand how I could be reading about these other gods and if that was going against with my beliefs. And so now here I am, a homeschooling mother, about to teach my own kids about Greek mythology and even other religions. There's a lot of literature about different gods, and it brings up different religions. So how can we teach our kids these things while at the same time not giving them the impression that Christianity is also mythology?
Yeah. Yeah. So two questions in there. So, the first one about how do we teach Christianity as not mythology? That's where the resurrection of Jesus is like the most incredible thing, because Christianity is entirely based on the resurrection of Jesus. Like if Jesus did not rise from the dead, like you and I are wasting our time. And even Paul says that, like if we only have, if Christ was not raised, we are still in our sin. And if we only have Christ, hope in Christ in this life only, like we above all people are to be pitied. And so the incredible thing about the resurrection is it's a historical event. It's not a feeling. It's not some mystical thing that we experience. It's a historical event. So a great thing we can do with our kids, at Easter is just to look through the evidence for the resurrection. I mean, that's a great thing that we can do, to talk about it being grounded in history. And then, when we're learning about Greek mythology, for example, we can look at like, okay, is this an actual historical event that we can go back and search for? We can look for the evidence for like no, it's completely different. Another thing, so I'll go really quickly. So onto Islam. When we're talking about Islam is not based on a historical event. It's based on the Prophet Muhammad receiving these visions from who he claimed was the angel Gabriel. Like that's not, like the same as the resurrection. This is one man by himself in the desert versus the testimony, of 11 men who were with Jesus, and then it says, Jesus appeared, to over 500 people. So this is like eyewitness testimony, not of one person, but of multiple people. And then with Greek mythology, I actually love using Greek mythology to help kids think critically and to understand the character and nature of God. Because one thing that's really interesting, so when we talk about, the Christian worldview teaches that man is created in God's image. When we look at Greek mythology, what we see is we see gods that reflect man's image. because these gods are petty and they're always fighting and they're doing things that even they would consider immoral. Like they're basically just reflecting human behavior. So one thing that I always recommend for parents and for teachers to do is when they start going through Greek mythology, to buy a book called The Attributes of God for Kids by a woman named Lydia White. And basically what she did is she took Tozer's work in the knowledge of the holy and she translated it down in language that like a 4-year-old can understand. And she has lots of great activities and there's songs. And so you can learn with your kids about the attributes of God. And so I always suggest that parents start by doing that. And then as you teach Greek mythology, ask your kids, okay, are there any ways in which these Greek gods are similar to God in his attributes? And are there any ways in which they are different? And I mean, the differences are so huge, that God is constantly self-sacrificing and he is love because he's Trinity, where these gods are always fighting and they're, like they're killing people and all of these things. So I would recommend when you introduce, other literature from other cultures, from other religions, always then anchoring it back to like, okay, how is this similar to or different than the God of the Bible? Because when you do that, all of a sudden it becomes so clear how incredible the God we serve is and how powerful he is and how he's so superior to any of these other false deities.
That's a great point. I hadn't thought about that. So it's a good opportunity to compare and contrast, and ultimately, of course, God will be glorious compared to the false gods. Definitely good advice there. And is there anything else you'd like to add about this overall topic that we might have left out?
I think we covered a lot of really important things, and you hit on a lot of things that I think most parents are probably wrestling with. Just how do I do this? And just I want to encourage you. Just it seems like you're doing such a good job of being intentional, with everything that you're doing with your kids, and that's the wonderful thing that we know that we can trust that God is faithful, that He will bring to completion the good work that He's begun in us, and we want to pray that for our children as well. And yes, just seek out good resources that are going to continue to help you, along this journey.
Yeah, my takeaway from this is that I'll be teaching my kids apologetics in my homeschooling experience and using resources that help. They've done the work, and so they'll help definitely. Where can people learn more about you and what you're doing? How can they follow you?
Yes. So if you go to the website, foundationworldview.com, you can find all sorts of resources. We have different blog posts that are written for you to read to your kids. We have different blog posts that give you ideas to do with your kids. And then we just have a ton of curricular resources of things that you can actually bring into your home where all the work's done for you. In the curriculum that I have, I actually do all of the teaching for you so that you don't have to sit down and study it, but you can actually watch the video together with your kids and go through the teaching together. So if you go to foundationworldview.com, you can get all the information there.
Awesome. I always like curriculum that just kind of gives you a script or just makes it a little easier for you because there's already a lot of other things that we have to teach. So I'll definitely be checking out your curriculum and recommending it. So thank you again so much for your time, Elizabeth, and for sharing this information with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Susan.